Aviation has rules for everything. How high you fly, how fast, how close two aircraft can come before it becomes dangerous. There are protocols for turbulence, protocols for emergencies, protocols for what you do when the sky turns hostile and nothing goes the way you planned. Nobody writes a protocol for falling in love at 35,000 feet. Nobody writes one for what happens after. Leo had been a flight attendant for 6 years before he ever met Brian. 6 years of perfect posture and perfect composure and a uniform pressed so sharp it could cut glass. 6 years of suppressants taken every morning without fail because in the aviation industry, especially in the premium cabin, you could not afford to be known as an Omega. Not back then. The culture had been shifting slowly the way glaciers shift. But slowly wasn't fast enough for Leo. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much sleep, too many holidays, too many pieces of himself to let biology become his ceiling. So every morning, one small white pill. And every morning, Leo became invisible in the way that mattered most. He was good at his job. Genuinely good. The kind of flight attendant passengers wrote letters about. Not because he was warm in some performative way, but because he actually noticed people. He'd see a passenger gripping their armrest before takeoff and have a glass of water ready before they had to ask. He read the cabin like a book. He knew who needed quiet and who needed conversation and who just needed someone to silently acknowledge that flying was, in fact, a little terrifying when you thought too hard about it. His colleagues liked him. His supervisors adored him. And for 6 years, that was enough. Brian changed the equation before Leo even knew his name. It started with a roster change. Leo had been assigned to a long-haul rotation, London Heathrow, then Singapore, then back, and someone in scheduling had shuffled the crew manifest at the last minute. Captain Brian Kong had been pulled in to cover after the original captain reported sick. Leo didn't know any of this until he boarded the aircraft for the pre-flight briefing and walked into the cockpit to introduce himself, as protocol required, and there was Brian, seated, reviewing charts. A man who somehow managed to make a flight deck feel smaller just by existing in it. He looked up, and Leo's suppressants, which had never once failed him in 6 years, sent a single tremor through his nervous system like a piano string plucked too hard. He covered it, obviously, smiled, introduced himself, completed the briefing, left the cockpit. Professional, precise, exactly as trained. But standing in the galley 30 seconds later, Leo pressed his back against the cold cabinet and breathed through his nose and thought, that is a problem. Brian's scent had reached him through 2 meters of cockpit air and whatever cologne the man was wearing. Something understated, nothing that would have registered on a beta or another alpha, and it had landed in Leo's blood like a key finding a lock it didn't know existed. Perfect match. That was the biological term. It didn't happen often. Most suppressant users went their whole careers without encountering it. Leo had read about it in textbooks. He had assumed it was largely theoretical. It was not theoretical. They flew together 4 times over the next 3 months. Each time, Leo told himself it would be easier. Each time, it wasn't. Brian was not what Leo had expected from a man with his reputation. The senior cabin crew had warned him. Kong is old school, runs a tight ship, doesn't like unnecessary noise or questions he doesn't consider relevant. And yes, Brian was precise, controlled. He ran his flights with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to be felt. But he was also attentive in a way that Leo hadn't anticipated. He asked the cabin crew their names and actually used them. He checked in before long stretches of turbulence. He never made anyone feel small. And he kept finding reasons to be near Leo. Not in an obvious way. Never anything Leo could call out or report or even clearly articulate. But Brian would linger in the galley doorway during the quieter hours of a night flight, ostensibly reviewing something on his phone, while Leo prepped the meal service. He would ask Leo's opinion on passenger situations that Brian, with 20 years of flight experience, absolutely did not need a junior crew member's input on. He once spent 11 minutes standing in the narrow galley corridor on the pretext of checking a panel that maintenance later confirmed had no recorded fault. Leo knew what was happening. He just refused to name it. And in his more honest moments, in the crew rest area with the lights dimmed and the engines a low constant hum below him, Leo admitted to himself that the lingering went both ways. There was one evening, on the return from Singapore, where Brian had left his jacket in the crew rest area by accident. Leo had found it. He had held it for a moment longer than necessary before folding it over his arm to return it. Just a moment. Just long enough for Brian's scent to settle into his lungs like something warm and unbearably familiar. He gave the jacket back without making eye contact. Brian thanked him quietly. Neither of them said anything else. But Leo lay in his bunk afterward with his heart doing something complicated and remembered that some species of birds choose their mates not by display or by combat, but by scent alone. Just scent. The oldest, most honest language the body knows. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that every morning with his pill. London in December has a particular kind of cold. Not dramatic. Not the kind that makes you feel alive or heroic. Just gray and close and relentless. The kind that makes hotel rooms feel smaller and the distance between people feel somehow both wider and more dangerous. They had been grounded. A storm front had rolled in from the Atlantic faster than forecast, shutting down Heathrow departures for at least 18 hours. The crew had been bussed to a layover hotel near the terminal. Decent rooms, no particular charm, and given the afternoon and evening to rest. Leo had taken his evening suppressant at 7. By 9, he knew something was wrong. He'd been running the same brand for 2 years. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that the batch his pharmacy had dispensed the week before had been compromised during storage. A temperature issue in transit. The chemistry disrupted just enough to make the dosage inconsistent. He found out later. That detail doesn't matter much now, except that it explains why, by 10 o'clock that night, Leo's suppressants failed for the first and only time in his career. Heat. Not a full biological heat. He wasn't in a true cycle but partial. Destabilized. Enough that his scent shifted, broke through, became something the ventilation system of a mid-range hotel in West London was absolutely not equipped to manage. He stayed in his room, locked the door, ran the shower cold, sent a text to the senior crew member claiming a migraine, told himself he could manage 12 hours. Just 12 hours. Then they'd be back in the air and he'd get to his own pharmacy, and this would be a near miss he'd never tell anyone about. He almost managed it. Brian knocked at 11:15. Later, much later, Brian would tell him that he had woken from a dead sleep, that something had pulled him conscious with the kind of biological urgency that bypassed rational thought entirely, that he had stood in the hallway outside Leo's room for 2 full minutes arguing with himself before raising his hand to knock. Leo opened the door. He would not have opened the door for anyone else. He knew that. He accepted it about himself. But it was Brian. And Leo was standing there in the cold light of a hotel corridor with his biology finally saying something truthful after 6 years of silence, and Brian looked at him. Not with hunger, not with predatory alpha certainty, but with something that looked almost like pain and said quietly, "I'm not going to come in unless you want me to." Leo stepped back from the door. Brian came in. Their joining wasn't simple. It was never going to be simple. But here is what Leo remembered most clearly. In the months after, when he was trying to understand how he had let it happen. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't purely biology overriding his better judgment. It was that Brian was gentle. Terribly, unexpectedly gentle. He kept pausing, kept checking, kept making space for Leo to change his mind. He held Leo's face like he was something worth protecting and said, barely above a whisper, that he had been trying to stay away from Leo for 3 months, and he was sorry if that had made things harder. Leo laughed at that. Actually laughed. Short and helpless, with his forehead pressed to Brian's shoulder. It was the most honest sound he had made in years. The nodding, when it came, wasn't the violent, impersonal act that Omegaverse fiction sometimes made it. It was slow. It was complete. It was the biological world catching up to something that had already been decided months ago in a galley doorway, and a crew rest area, and 100 small moments where 2 people had stood close enough to acknowledge that proximity, for them, was not neutral. Leo fell asleep with Brian's arms around him and Brian's sense saturating everything and felt, for the first time in 6 years, like his body was finally being honest about something. He should have stayed asleep. He didn't. He woke at 5 in the morning before Brian stirred, and lay very still in the gray pre-dawn light and felt the weight of what had occurred settle over him slowly. He wasn't sorry. That was the problem. He should have been calculating exit strategies and professional damage control, and instead he felt warm, settled, like something that had been pulling him off-center for months had finally released. He watched Brian sleep for a while, took that in. Then he got up to get water, and on the way back, he passed the window. Brian's phone was on the table beside the window. The screen had lit with a message. Leo wasn't reading it, he wasn't. But the preview was visible. A name, Choi and Associates, Family Legal. And below it, words he couldn't unsee. Mating contract documents ready for signature. Appointment confirmed. 9 a.m. Leo stood very still. 9 a.m. This morning. London. Brian had a mating contract. Already drafted. Already scheduled. Leo stood in the gray hotel light with bare feet on the carpet and felt the warmth of the last 7 hours drain out of him like water through sand. He didn't wake Brian. He didn't ask. He packed his bag in silence the way you pack when you're trying not to make a sound that might force a conversation you're not able to have. He called the airline's crew scheduling line from the bathroom and cited a personal emergency. He was out of the hotel by 6:15. He never went back. What Leo didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, standing at that window at 5 in the morning with his judgment clouded by heartbreak and residual heat and 6 years of trained self-protection, was that Brian had requested that meeting specifically to reject the contract. His family had been arranging it for 2 years. An alpha of Brian's status marrying into another aviation family. A neat and sensible pairing that Brian had been quietly refusing for months and had finally agreed to formalize the rejection of, in writing through a lawyer so his family would stop bringing it up. He had been planning to cancel any arrangement that stood between him and Leo. Leo didn't know. And Brian, waking to an empty room and an unanswered message, didn't know what Leo had seen. That misunderstanding cost them 5 years. Leo resigned from the airline by email. Gave no reason. Forwarded his medical documents to a private Omega clinic 2 suburbs from his apartment and started the process of understanding what the nodding had done to his biology, which was exactly what biology designed it to do. He was pregnant by week 3. He sat with that knowledge for a long time before he let himself feel anything about it. He was methodical by nature. He made lists. He assessed resources. He called his sister, who was the only person in his life who knew his designation, and told her in a flat, careful voice that he needed help, and she drove 3 hours to his apartment without asking a single clarifying question and sat with him while he cried in a way he hadn't cried since he was 19. The pregnancy was not easy. It wasn't supposed to be, not for an Omega who had spent 6 years suppressing his biology. His body had a lot to recalibrate. The first trimester was brutal. Nausea that arrived without warning and left without apology, exhaustion that felt almost punitive, and a hormonal volatility that made him feel like a stranger in his own skin. But there were other things too. The nesting instinct arrived at week 14 and it surprised him. He had never nested before, had never felt the pull of it. Suddenly he found himself rearranging his apartment, buying soft blankets he didn't need, reorganizing the closet with a specificity that had no logical basis but felt desperately important. He would come home from his new job, administrative work at a small regional airport, far from any international route, and spend his evenings folding baby clothes in the particular order that his body insisted was correct, and feel a strange peace settling over him even as the longing ached underneath. The longing. That was the one he hadn't prepared for. And Omega's biology, post-nodding, is designed to seek the alpha. That's not poetry. It's chemistry. The bond isn't completed by the physical act alone. It wants proximity, continuity, the scent of the specific alpha who had claimed it. Without that, Leo's hormones ran a constant quiet deficit. His body kept reaching for something that wasn't there. He channeled it into his work, into his sister's visits, into the baby, who grew steadily and stubbornly inside him while Leo watched his belly round and remembered the feeling of Brian's hands and tried very hard not to wonder where Brian was. The birth was in April. A boy. Leo held him in the hospital at 2 in the morning, the room quiet and the city outside the window doing whatever cities do at 2 in the morning, and looked at his son's face and felt the love and the grief arrive simultaneously. Two tides hitting the same shore at once, indistinguishable from each other. His son had his father's eyes. He named him Luca. 5 years is long enough for a new life to feel real. Long enough for routines to calcify into something you stop questioning. Leo had his job at the regional airport. He had a small house he'd rented with a garden Luca destroyed cheerfully on a regular basis. He had 2 colleagues he trusted, one neighbor who had become a friend, and a morning routine so consistent it had worn grooves into his day. Luca was, by any reasonable assessment, a remarkable child. Focused in a way that 4-year-olds rarely are. Already obsessed with aircraft. Could identify a commercial jet by engine sound from across a parking lot, which Leo found unsettling in a deeply proud way. Wore a toy pilot's cap so constantly that Leo had bought 3 identical replacements because the original was faded to a pale ghost of itself. Leo did not date. He told himself he was too busy. He was, in fact, too busy. But the real reason, the one he didn't examine closely in the daylight, was simpler. His biology had been claimed. His body still knew it. Whatever Brian had left in his chemistry 5 years ago hadn't faded the way it was supposed to without ongoing contact. It had just gone quiet, the way certain sounds go quiet in winter. Still there. Just waiting. He had not looked Brian up. That was a rule. He maintained it carefully. The day of the reunion was a Tuesday in October. A maintenance issue had grounded a private jet. A charter, carrying executives from a major airline expansion consortium, at Leo's regional airport. Unscheduled. The kind of diversion that small airports handle with barely contained chaos, calling in extra staff and commandeering the one decent lounge for a group of important-looking people in expensive coats. Leo was in the terminal because Luca's school had been closed for a teacher training day and Leo's backup care had fallen through and he had brought his son to work like the exhausted, resourceful single parent he was, setting Luca up in the corner of the operations office with a tablet and a sandwich and a stern instruction to stay put. Luca lasted approximately 40 minutes before locating the terminal lounge. He was standing in the middle of it, toy pilot's cap on, watching the grounded jet through the floor-to-ceiling windows with the focused reverence of a child at a cathedral, when the group of diverted passengers began filing in. Brian saw the boy before he saw Leo. Later, he would say that it was the scent. That even before he consciously processed what he was seeing, something in his alpha biology had registered a child whose scent was structurally, biologically, unmistakably half his own. He stopped walking. The executive behind him nearly walked into him. He stood in the entrance of the lounge of a regional airport in October and looked at a small boy in a pilot's cap and felt his entire understanding of the last 5 years rearrange itself into a shape that didn't make sense yet but was already, irreversibly, true. Then Leo came through the door. He was in his work uniform, the airport administrative staff polo, nothing like the tailored airline uniform Brian had known him in, and he was looking at his phone and calling his son's name in the slightly exasperated tone of a parent who has lost track of a small person for the 4th time that week, and then he looked up and he saw Brian. The phone stayed in his hand. He stopped. They stood approximately 6 meters apart in a mid-sized regional airport lounge while several airline executives milled around them completely oblivious, and the 5 years between them expanded and contracted simultaneously, and neither of them spoke. Luca, unaware that the universe had just pivoted on its axis, pointed at the jet outside and said to no one in particular, "That's a Gulfstream G700. The winglets are different from the G650. Brian looked down at him, then back at Leo. Leo's jaw was set. His posture was the rigid, controlled composure of someone who had trained for 6 years to manage exactly this. A crisis in a professional environment where falling apart was not an option. He crossed the room. He took Luca's hand gently, redirecting him toward the door, already formulating something to say that would be neutral and brief and allow him to exit. Brian said, quietly, "Leo," and Leo stopped. Not because of the word. He had heard his name before. But Brian's voice, in person, after 5 years of keeping it out of his mind by sheer disciplinary force, it landed somewhere beneath his sternum and stayed. 5 minutes, Brian said. Please. They stood in a corridor off the lounge, outside earshot of everyone. Luca sat 20 feet away on a bench, deeply engaged with his tablet, occasionally glancing up to inspect approaching aircraft with professional skepticism. Brian looked at him with an expression that Leo couldn't read and couldn't look away from. He's mine, Brian said. It wasn't a question. Leo didn't insult him by answering it as one. Yes. Brian was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't emptiness. It's something being held very carefully. Then he said, that morning in London, the legal documents. You saw them. Leo looked at him. You saw the file from Choi and Associates. You had a mating contract. I was signing the rejection. Brian's voice was level. I had been refusing my family's arrangement for 2 years. I went to that appointment to terminate it legally so they couldn't bring it back. I came back to the hotel to tell you. A pause. You were gone. Leo heard that, heard every word of it, and felt something enormous and quiet move through him. Not quite relief, not quite grief, not the clean catharsis of a resolved misunderstanding. More like watching a locked door open and realizing you had been standing in front of it for 5 years. I didn't know, Leo said. His voice came out lower than intended. I know you didn't. I wouldn't have if I'd known. I wouldn't have. He stopped. Looked at Luca. I wasn't trying to keep him from you. I didn't think you. He stopped again because the sentence had too many endings and none of them were sufficient. Brian followed his gaze to the small boy on the bench. Luca had taken off the pilot's cap and was turning it over in his hands, inspecting the stitching. Brian watched him with something careful and enormous moving across his face. What's his name? Brian asked. Luca. Brian nodded. Slowly, like he was allowing himself to understand the weight of it in increments. Then he turned back to Leo, and the expression on his face, not anger, not accusation, nothing punishing, was the same expression Leo remembered from a hotel doorway in London on a December night. The one that looked almost like pain. The one that made space. I looked for you, Brian said. After you resigned. I looked for 8 months. You had covered your tracks well. I was hiding. I know. I was protecting. I know, Leo. His voice was quiet. I know. They stood in the corridor with 5 years and one small boy and one misread document between them, and Leo felt the bond that his biology had been carrying quietly, in deficit for 60 months. Felt it register Brian's proximity and simply exhale, like it had been holding its breath. Brian reached out and touched Leo's hand. Not grabbing, not claiming, just his hand against Leo's, light enough that Leo could have pulled away without effort. He didn't pull away. I'm not asking you to pretend 5 years didn't happen, Brian said. I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give. But I'd like to know my son. A pause. And I'd like the chance to know you again. If you'll let me. Leo looked at him for a long moment. At this man who had stood at a hotel door and given him the choice. Who had apparently spent 8 months searching for someone who didn't want to be found and then, when that trail went cold, had carried the silence rather than move on. He already knows what a Gulfstream G700 is, Leo said finally. He identified yours from the wing shape. Brian blinked. He's going to want to know everything about that jet. Leo exhaled. You should probably be ready for a very thorough interrogation. Brian looked at him, and then quietly, slowly, he smiled. It was the first time Leo had seen him smile in 5 years. It still landed the same way it always had, like something warm finding the cold places. I think I can manage that, Brian said. Luca looked up when they approached together. He assessed Brian with the frank, unfiltered appraisal that only 5-year-olds and very senior executives can get away with. Is that your plane? He asked Brian directly. It is. Why is it stopped? Small problem with one of the systems. It's being fixed. Luca considered this. My dad says you should always check the systems before you go, he said, with the tone of someone delivering an established truth. Brian glanced at Leo. Leo looked at the ceiling briefly. Your dad is right, Brian said, crouching to Luca's level with a naturalness that quietly broke something in Leo's chest. He usually is. Luca studied him for another moment with those eyes, Brian's eyes, unmistakably in Leo's face, and then appeared to reach a satisfactory internal conclusion. He held out the toy pilot's cap. You can hold this while you're here, he said. If you want. Brian took it, carefully, with both hands. He didn't look at Leo, but Leo saw his jaw move. Once, the controlled swallow of someone processing something too large for the moment they are currently standing in. Thank you, Brian said, to Luca. Quietly, Luca nodded, picked up his tablet, resumed his aircraft inspection, and Leo stood in a regional airport corridor in October, watching the alpha who had claimed him hold his son's toy pilot's hat like it was something irreplaceable, and felt the long, particular grief of 5 years of unnecessary distance begin. Slowly, imperfectly, not all at once, to release. Not fixed, not clean, not the way it is in stories where the misunderstanding resolves and everything resets. More honest than that. Two people at the beginning of something, again with a small boy between them who already knew what a Gulfstream G700 was, and couldn't know yet what he had just done to the story his parents were living in. The systems were fixed by late afternoon. Brian's jet was cleared for departure just before 5. He didn't leave.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.